Monsanto was able to convince the first Bush administration that, for some reason, that GMOs would increase U.S. exports and the U.S. domination of world food trade. Food is the biggest traded category in the world, and for some reason they believed Monsanto and the biotech industry that GMOs was the key, because the U.S. was suffering a trade deficit at the time, and there was a committee called the Council of Competitiveness, chaired by Vice President Dan Quayle. And so Dan Quayle actually announced in late May 1992 that they were going to fast-track these GMOs, and 2 days later, the FDA policy came out claiming, that the GMOs were not substantially different, that they had no knowledge of any significant information showing that GMOs were different, and on that basis, there would be absolutely no testing of GMOs required, no labeling of GMOs required. In fact, companies like Monsanto could put a GMO on the market without even telling the FDA. And that is the current policy at the FDA now. Now, in terms of Monsanto's influence, it turns out they had a direct, complete influence on that policy. The White House had instructed the FDA to promote the biotechnology industry, so the FDA created a new position, the Deputy Commissioner for Policy, to oversee the creation of the GMO policy, and they created the position for Michael Taylor, Monsanto's former attorney. And then Michael Taylor then became Monsanto's vice president afterwards, and then now he's the U.S. food safety czar in the Obama administration.
Yes, exactly.
And so it was basically Monsanto's man, and he completely ignored the scientific concerns, as we discussed earlier. Now, at the same time, Monsanto's bovine growth hormone was being evaluated, and not only was Michael Taylor in charge of that process, but the person who was the chief reviewer formerly worked as a contractor for Monsanto on RBGH. Then there was a Margaret Miller who did research on bovine growth hormone for Monsanto, and then took a position in charge of the division that was evaluating her own research. And I talked to one FDA former employee, said that, it was completely a disaster there. He tried to slow down the approval process by ordering more appropriate tests and was fired. And in a lawsuit, he had to be reinstated, and they admitted that it was a setup to get him out of there because he was slowing down the process of approval of RBGH. So it was completely manipulated, politically and economically corrupt, overruling the science and the scientists. And unfortunately, as I've traveled to 32 countries speaking about GMOs and meeting with officials and activists and others, what Monsanto pulled off in the U.S., they pull off all over the world.
Yeah.
It was obvious in Canada, for example, where the senior scientists testified that they had been pressured by their superiors to approve Monsanto's bovine growth hormone. They even admitted that Monsanto offered them a bribe of $1 to $2 million to approve RBGH without further study. I was in Brazil, where it's basically Monsanto's or the biotech industry's people that approve GMOs in their CTN Bio organization, and that I spoke to some of the minority independent scientists who were completely frustrated and angry that the people that approve it don't even read the submissions and don't bother looking at any adverse findings. Same thing in India. And in Europe, we have the European Food Safety Authority, whose GMO wing is basically staffed largely by people who are pro-GMO and work on organizations to promote GMOs into Europe. And if you look at some of their evaluations, they're basically a cut-and-paste job from Monsanto's own materials. So they've already proven through their incompetence, which can be clearly documented, that they're not really upholding science and protecting the public. Their design is to promote the interests of companies like Monsanto.
Yeah. So they're still alive at large and pushing their agenda, obviously, which is shocking at this point that the people haven't become aware of this. But I mean, some things were even under we heard that things were going to change under Obama, but as you said, Michael Taylor was reinstated under Obama as well, and now he's behind what is called the Green Revolution in Africa as well. He's been pushing GM foods on Ghana and other countries in Africa as well. Isn't that right, Jeffrey?
Yes, I'm afraid he is one of the authors of this program for supposedly feeding Africa, and what they're doing is they want to force feed Africa the GMOs. You know, it's this myth that GMOs are needed to feed the world, and yet the most comprehensive report on agriculture ever produced, with 60 countries signing on, supported by the WTO, the WHO, UN, etc., and with over 400 scientists, concluded that the current generation of GMOs has nothing to offer to feed the world and solve poverty problems.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing. In
Mm-hmm.
fact, the Union of Concerned Scientists report, the most comprehensive evaluation of yield figures, found that GMOs on average reduce yield, and that we know that other sustainable methods increase yield dramatically. There was a study of over 12 million farms in 57 countries that found when sustainable technologies were introduced, yields went up 79%. Compare that to GMOs like GM soy, where yield drops by 5 to 10%. Furthermore, the unpredicted side effects associated with genetic engineering can create unreliable yield figures,
Mm-hmm.
and that can be a disaster in developing countries where many of the farmers will take out very high interest loans to pay for seeds if they're not saving seeds, which happened in India, and millions of farmers borrowed money to take out loans to pay for Monsanto's genetically modified cotton seeds because they were promised higher yields. And in many cases, there was a failure of the crop such that the farmers could not even pay back their high-interest loans, and up to 200,000 farmers have committed suicide as a result. The UK Daily Mail estimates 125,000. Vandana Shiv estimates closer to 200,000. Either way, it's an absolute biotech genocide.
Yeah, it is. So what do you make, Jeffrey, of the global seed vaults up in Svalbard in Norway? When I read about this, I get a feeling that, this is the place where they store the good seeds, so to speak, the genetically diverse seeds, and it's being funded by some very interesting, people and organizations. And while they're storing away all these good seeds, the rest of the seeds that are being lodged on the public and all the countries around the world is these kind of Terminator seed technology kinds of seeds that are they're kind of weak. They don't have any diversity in terms of their genetics as well. And if something were to change in the environment, and even before that, just as you outlined, they will indeed fail. Well, so what do you make of that? Is that a conspiracy behind that in terms of dealing with what they term overpopulation, or what do you think is going on there, Jeffrey?
Well, I've heard that conspiracy, but I haven't seen any data that supports that directly. I have met the director of the Seed Vault in Norway, and he's not in favor of GMOs. He worked with Francis Moore Lepay, who wrote Diet for a Small Planet. He worked at Food First. He's a very good fellow, I think, from my experience, and he's written a good book as well. As far as the funders go, it's hard to know what their motivation is, but I tell you that seed banks are all over the world.
Yes.
And it's not a new thing. It's just that this is the big mother of all seed banks, and it's in a very dramatic place, built into a side of a mountain in a freezing Arctic area. So it has a lot of drama associated with it. I think it's a good idea to have that. I think it's a good idea in any case, whether someone is worried about GMOs taking over or whether someone is just simply looking at climate change. So I don't want to speculate about any sinister motives there because I'm not aware of any directly. But seed banks are important. Now, unfortunately, the biotech industry has been trying to take over seed banks to get the germplasm in order to develop genetically modified varieties from the diversity that's represented in these seed banks. And that's a great danger because, as we said before, Monsanto's goal was to genetically engineer 100% of the world's food supply and seed supply, and these seed banks are a way to do that. And so that's one of the reasons that they invest, is so that they can have access and so that they can basically replace nature with their patented creations.
One of the things that you've been working with is listing brands that are non-GMO. Is this primarily in the U.S. or are you doing this in other countries as well around the world?
Well, we have a non-GMO shopping guide which focuses on the U.S. Many of those products are also available around the world, especially in Canada. Greenpeace has done a great job in creating non-GMO shopping guides in many, many countries. In fact, sometimes when I tour a country and popularize the health risks, I'm told by them that the orders for their shopping guides skyrocket to unprecedented levels, which is very exciting. But the shopping guide is very, very critical in the United States. Most people outside the United States don't realize that 95% of Americans, when surveyed, want GMOs labeled. But because the FDA is still mandated to promote biotechnology for the last 20 years, they ignore virtually all Americans in order to promote the economic interests of 5 biotech companies that make GMOs. Now, in a New York Times survey, it said that 53% of Americans would avoid eating GMOs if they were labeled. So, of course, the FDA is not going to label it if they want to promote the business, because if it were labeled, it would be a death knell to biotechnology, because no one would put GMOs in their product if more than half of Americans are not going to eat it. And so the reason why GMOs flourish in the United States is entirely based on ignorance of consumers by what products are GMO and the dangers that have been documented. So all we're doing is providing education to consumers, telling them what they should have been told by the government, that these things are unsafe, and here's what contains GMOs, and here's what don't. So it's a very critical piece for our tipping point campaign, and we're just now reproducing a new version of our shopping guide. This time, only those that are enrolled in the new non-GMO project third-party verified system are going to be included in our guide, because until this point, there was no standard for making non-GMO claims, and one company's standard could be very thin, where another one could be very robust.
And I guess what I want to ask is, well, what foods we need to avoid if we don't want to have GMOs into our system. And I've heard you mention soy, corn, canola, but what is going on in terms of labeling here as well? Is labeling mandatory around the world, that if something contains GMO, it has to be on the label when you buy it?
Well, yeah, in the United States, of course, it's not mandatory. That's just why there's the voluntary non-GMO labels. Same with Canada, not required. Europe has a system where it's required if there's unintentional, either something is intentionally GMO, any ingredient, it has to be labeled, or if there's an unintentional contamination of greater than 0.9%. Now, a big gap in the labeling requirement in Europe is that you don't have to label milk or meat from animals that have been fed GMOs, which is a very serious omission. And there's certainly evidence that the milk and meat may be affected in terms of human health effects. There's evidence in terms of theoretical understanding and what could happen and the changes that have occurred in animals as a result of eating GMOs, but no studies, unfortunately, directly on humans that have been eating GMOs. So this gap in the requirements has allowed animal feed that's genetically engineered to pour into Europe or pour into other countries that then export their meat products into Europe.
How is it in terms of corn syrup, though? I mean, and I bring this up because I recently went to the U.S. and while I was there, I was reading a lot of the labels, and much as everything almost has corn syrup in it now these days, and many products here in Sweden and other countries in Europe as well. First of all, obviously, it's no wonder that so many people are overweight considering the corn syrup. But do you know if that is genetically modified as well, Jeffrey?
In the U.S., virtually all corn syrup is genetically modified unless it's been imported from Europe. Now, there's some European plants that make corn syrup, and they don't use GM corn, as far as I understand, because if they did, it would have to be labeled on the product. So if it says corn syrup in Europe, but there's no label that says made from genetically modified ingredients, then the plant that produces the corn syrup purchases non-GM corn, which is logical because there's very little corn growing in Europe. Now, to be honest, the enforcement of the labels has not been profound, so there may be some contamination above the 0.9% levels. But nonetheless, That's, basically it's very little GMOs. Now, to